Hi, I'd like to start with a little story of how I got into contributing in open source. So back in 2020, I got my first full-time job as a front-end web developer. But at the time, I have an issue where I'm trying to find technologies to learn, but I always don't have the time to put it in side projects. So I was thinking, what could be less effort but have the same gain in return? So that's when I looked into open source projects, and the first one I contributed to is Vite, which is a Svelte plugin for Vite. And I quite like it. I use it at work, and I found a bug, but then I made a fix. And then what I find is that the fix I made contributed to everyone who's using the package. And I kind of feel great knowing about that. And from there on, I've been working on open source since. So the topic for today will be contributing 101, which I'll cover tips and tricks and everything you need to know about contributing in the world of open source. So a little bit about me. I'm Bjorn. I'm from Malaysia. I am currently a core team member of Vite and Svelte. I'm also a core resident in Astro, and I've been dabbling with open source for about 2 years right now. And I also love nature. I could spend like hours watching the sky or something. But without further ado, jump next to the main point, which is open source. So you may know this in the open source community, we have this acronym called OSS. So what is OSS? OSS stands for open source software, which is software that you can read the source code directly to understand how it works. And oftentimes, open source software is also related to something called FOSS, which is F that stands for free, so free and open source software. This is usually the case because open source software is easily distributed free, but sometimes you can see paid software as well. For example, paid licenses or commercial licenses. But you quickly notice a problem. If it's free, how does it sustain itself? So this is a big deal. And sometimes you notice like an issue like this on GitHub where someone's asking if a project is to maintain. Sometimes it's true because the project is working fine as is and there isn't anything that needs to be maintained, so that it's perfectly fine. But sometimes it actually is abandoned because the project maintainers doesn't have the resources to continue on the project and it is left as is. And this is also an issue that comes up often in the world of open source. So how do we help? So from my experience thus far is that there is basically 3 things that we could help. So the way to summarize it is that with code, community, and funding. So in this talk, I'd like to deep dive into these 3 points and provide information of how you could work in these areas and contribute to them. So contributing code. The first thing we would do in a project would be making bug reports. So if you find an issue, you create a bug report. But something important to notice is that making sure that it is actually a bug. Sometimes you may only have a question or you're uncertain if you're doing it the right way. Sometimes it is actually a configuration issue where in your project you're not using the project correctly. So knowing if it's a bug or not saves a lot of time. And in that point, you would also want to follow the template. So each repositories may or may not have a template when filing an issue. If they do, it's important to follow the issue list and read through them and follow instructions to, for example, create a minimal reproduction. Because sometimes it's important for maintainers to easily reproduce issues so that they can easily hit it and make a fix quickly instead of having everyone manually implementing your own setup. So this is contributing code. But the main takeaway from this is that it saves times for contributors. So not only the maintainers, but anyone who is interested in helping in the project would also benefit from if you follow these guides. But besides creating bug reports, there's something else you can do, which is directly making the fix yourself. So when you start making a fix, it could be on a small project or could be in a big project. For a small project, it may take 30 minutes or an hour plus to digest everything and make the fix. But sometimes in a big project, it could be hard, which is understandable. to this day, I don't really understand everything in the Vite code base, but that is fine. And an easy way to start off is to read the contributing guide. It should have all the information you need to set up the project locally, to test it, and to make changes that you need and where to find it. And I've also found it easiest to start with fixing a bug, since a bug usually touches a very specific domain. So you only have to fix maybe a specific file or maybe just a directory. So you don't have to read the entire code base to make your own fix, but only a certain small piece of code. And usually this is enough for you to gain context on the fix itself and send a PR or a pull request. But sometimes if you get blocked, in Vite, we have a contributing channel in Discord where all the contributors, including the core maintainers, are there to help. But it's also important to understand that sometimes people are busy and they may not get in touch with you soon. So you may have to figure things out yourself. But I think ultimately this leads to the final point where this a self-learning experience where you're more independent on your own in the world of open source. But you also, at the end of the day, save time for maintainers since you're doing them a favor in the long run. Another thing you could do is by triaging bug reports. So on the image on the right, you could see that there's a bunch of issues which is not being viewed yet. And this is a common problem in big open source projects, is that there are so many problems, but there's so little time to understand, is that actually a problem or is it already fixed, etc. Which kind of brings back to point number one, where you should understand whether it's a bug or not. But if you're interested in triaging issues, which is a very helpful thing to do because it acts as a first line of defense before the issue reaches to the hands of the maintainers, because sometimes an issue is invalid or it lacks a reproduction, and these could be easily skimmed off before we dive deeper into it. And going through all these issues also helps us understand edge cases. Sometimes you find a very specific issue or 5 or more issues that are kind of related to each other. So you would have like context on specific issues where you could fix in a holistic way instead of fixing just one very specific thing. And also triaging issues helps you understand the context behind decisions. For example, if maintainers decide to reject a proposal or reject a bug, maybe because it's intentional, or maybe there's like a very good reason it is out of scope of the project. So knowing how to act in certain cases like this is very helpful because you could think the way maintainers think, and that helps to release some of the responsibilities that they have. And of course, this often leads to experience in the project direction and their philosophy in a whole. And another thing you could do in contributing to code is reviewing code changes. So basically, when in a project you might have pull requests with a bunch of changes, reviewing PRs takes time too because you need to make sure that what change is correct and it doesn't break anything else. So if you're new to reviewing PRs, starting small is a good place to start. For example, typo changes, documentation, or small fixes to a very specific logic in the code, which is easily digestible. But also making comments also brings you to a long way, because making comments on specific issues you may find, for example, you try to test your PRs locally and you find problems or maybe not. But this shows that you put effort into reviewing PRs. So making comments kind of makes it more credible to the maintainers, knowing that you actually put effort into it. And lastly, this also comes up to the previous point, which is learn the context behind the decisions that the maintainers make. Sometimes you have changes that maintainers reject, or maybe they request specific code changes to it, because this helps you understand the specific patterns that the project uses. And further along, you start understanding specific patterns that you should follow, and you could bring this along too when you start reviewing PRs as well. And ultimately, from the previous points, you're actually applying your experience when you review your PRs. So from triaging issues, making issues, or just making a fix, these are all helpful in ultimately reviewing the PRs. That is code that's going into the main project. So to kind of summarize the code contribution point of view, you can kind of see that further along, the responsibilities start to rise. So this is more or less like a spectrum when you become from a contributor to a maintainer. So the more responsibility you get, the more important you are. But on the next point, we have the community. So community is also another very important aspect in a project. Like without a community, the project is basically no one uses it. So the first important thing is asking the right questions. So when you go in a community, you don't really just go on GitHub or just go anywhere. It is important to know where exactly you are supposed to ask the questions and also the information that you should give. Sometimes you give it too long or if it's too verbose, people don't really feel like checking it because it's like an essay and they have put a lot of effort to understand the question. So try to be short and concise. Try to give all the information needed so that someone can read it once and they can answer it once. So it saves time in both parties. And also keeping it short helps them to reduce the cognitive load when they try to understand what your problem is. And also, a side note, try not to spam in the channels because sometimes not everyone has the time to check out your problem or your question. And if it's important, feel free to always ping again, like in a couple of hours, so that everyone has a chance to revisit that again when the time comes. And while you're asking out questions, a helpful tip that I had in the past is try to answer them at the same time. So before you ask questions, you can look around, see if anyone else has problems. You can try to answer them the best you can and give ideas, even if you're not sure how to fix it. And that is a great way to invite others to answer your question as well, because it's like a two-way street where everyone is helping each other. And at the end of the day, sometimes questions actually bloom to a problem where documentation is a problem. It needs to be clarified. And all these leads to understanding the pain points of the project. So this is a very important thing where the users of the project know more than the maintainers. So for Vite, here are like a few links that Vite uses for support. You can go chat.vitejs.dev, which is a link to Discord. You can seek for help, or you can also ask in GitHub discussion in the ViteJS GitHub repo. You can also check out the documentation at vitejs.dev, and the documentation changes could also be made on the ViteJS repo. So the next point will be funding. So funding is also another important aspect. Even if you're only contributing money to it, it is vital for any project to sustain itself because maintainers are always spending their own free time working on it. So one way is to use sponsorship to sponsor them on a monthly basis or one-time basis. This includes GitHub sponsors or Patreon. And besides that, some companies also offer a percentage of the work working on open source so that, for example, you can work 70% on the main company work and 30% on open source work. And at the end of the day, it benefits both sides where the company may need the expertise of the open source project to work on their main company as well. But this is also another two-way street where it helps everyone. And also some developers offer consulting services, which is kind of like sponsorship, but you get something in return. Say you need support from the maintainers, you can get direct help from them, which is also another way to support these project maintainers. And ultimately, the project that you use or depend is also maintained, which also helps with the product that you use to build on top of it. So it will help you in return as well. To kind of summarize the talk, here's a handy list that I've made compiling every points that we have talked thus far, which you can use to reference in the future again. And most importantly, have fun. Work on projects that you're interested in, make it as a hobby. Don't try to push yourself too much and take breaks where needed. Don't burn out, and also be respectful to others who are also trying to contribute to open source as well. And that is all for my talk. Thank you for listening. I'd like to give special thanks to Dominic and Patak who helped me in the journey in open source where I've never been where I am today without their help. And you can look for me on my socials on GitHub, which is Bluey, or on Twitter, Bluey. Thank you.